Okay, Ethan, thanks for joining the show. And been reading up about your history. You've got quite a background, and appreciate you taking the time out to join us here on the show. So I'll let you give you a few minutes to introduce yourself. It looks like you have some past books as well. This is the new one here on Benghazi that we'll probably focus on, but I'm not opposed to hearing about your other projects and what maybe led you to writing, this Benghazi book. So.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me on your show. Uh, this book is it's called Benghazi, a new history of the fiasco that drove America and its world to the brink. And it's coming out on the 6th of September, just shortly shy of the 10th anniversary of the Benghazi attack in 2012. I I've been I've had quite a long association with Libya at this point. I was one of a handful of U.S. diplomats sent to Libya in 2004 when the U.S. was starting to re-engage with the then Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. And I spent 2 years in that capacity helping, reporting on aspects of the U.S.-Libya relationship and the reform process in Libya, and basically running around like many diplomats do as a sort of a reporter on the ground. The main difference or oddity about the situation was that we hadn't had a relationship with Gaddafi officially for more than 20 years at that point, and pretty much everything was new to us. So and Gaddafi was, as many people recall, or may recall, quite a quirky personality, and that permeated through to many aspects of the country, which otherwise is actually extraordinarily beautiful. And I really fell in love with many of the cities in Libya, particularly Benghazi, and developed many deep relationships there. So, I mean, the genesis of the book is sort of a background of what was going on. That relationship in 2004 was a product very directly of the post 9/11 angst and hoped by the Bush administration to try to use that event as sort of a lever to transform the Middle East. And we were really literally winging it in many regards. I left Libya in 2006. The relationship was not amazing, but actually deteriorating a bit. Gaddafi was complaining about various unkept promises on the part of the U.S., and the U.S. similarly had complaints about Gaddafi. But I didn't quite think that I would be back anytime soon. My next posting was back in Washington, and then after that, in the UAE. But several years later, the Libyan revolution broke out, and all of a sudden I felt this sort of somehow both willfully and not being sucked back into Libya by friends and former colleagues who were wanting assistance and just being fascinated by the fact that the Libyans could stand up to Gaddafi, that this was just something we had wondered about for some time, but didn't actually believe was going to happen. So I and a Libyan colleague, sort of thinking back on this, it sounds almost sort of, I don't know if crazy is the word, but impulsive, just at least. We decided to set up an NGO and go back and quit our jobs and set up an NGO and try to bring American medical assistance into Benghazi, and spent about a year and a half doing that. I reacquainted with Ambassador Stevens, who was, we all know, was very tragically killed in 2012. And we were making some progress on several fronts when the attack hit, and that basically threw everything into complete and utter chaos. And that had a big personal impact on me. It took me quite a while to recover from what what I experienced and how I felt the United States was reacting or not reacting at the time, and trying to figure out, along with everyone else, to some degree, what had just happened. And that's the origins of the book. It took me several years to be in a position where I felt I could actually have something useful to say, and then by that point, Benghazi became such a toxic mess that nobody really wanted to. Certainly, the Democrats didn't want to talk about it anymore, and Republicans wanted to talk about it selectively. It was really quite a challenge also to get this published, because essentially I got two reaction. One was it's too controversial, and second is no one's interested. So I was trying to explain that that's not exactly, that those are somewhat inconsistent, but there it is. So I finally, the 10th anniversary was, I guess, the hook that finally allowed that to happen.
Yeah, and going into our episode this evening, I got the question. They said, "Good God, Benghazi, won't they let that go?" And I was like, "No." I'm like, that was a big period in American politics and international relations. I'll ask you in a second, because I want to make sure we get more of your background in. But my other question is, Americans, in the whole Benghazi and the political thing, it was such a big deal. But honestly, outside of the U.S., was it made, or was it really that big of a deal that Americans were making it out to be? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think abroad people were largely completely baffled by by what Americans were focusing on, that this was a domestic squabble rather than, okay, you just got hit in Benghazi, you had just intervened in the country, there are all kinds of problems that are going to emerge out of this, what are you going to do about it? I think that's but I'm continually surprised at how many people I run into outside of the United States, and I just spent a couple of years abroad, who remember this. In one particularly bizarre episode, a couple of years ago, I was tromping through a forest on an island off of Africa, and somebody in my group who was local asked me, "So what was this Benghazi?" And had no idea that I had any connection to it. Now, what was this whole Benghazi thing? And so, so somebody's paying attention. These people in the more remote regions who have little reason to talk about Benghazi, clearly it affected some people. No, I mean, this was one of the big in terms of American political scandals, this is definitely at the top, in the top few over the years, and clearly one has to adjust for all kinds of things. But and another thing that is significant about Benghazi, I think it's the first social media powered scandal, and surely there have been many since, and will be many more. But Benghazi was kind of the mother of these in many ways. And I think one of the big paradox of Benghazi is that after all of the noise that was made and all of the tweets and social media posts and memes and everything else, we really don't know a whole lot about still what happened. It's almost happened and what its consequences were. It's as if this giant bilious smoke started pouring out and covering Washington and everywhere else, and it obscured what was going on in Benghazi on the ground and how we got into that mess in the first place. It obscured what the impacts were on places like Libya, which despite our early efforts then sort of basically rolled off a cliff, and had impacts on places, on what we were trying to do or hoping would be the outcome in places like Syria and Yemen. It sounds a bit far-fetched, but in fact you can see the sort of ripple effects emanating out from Benghazi, and we were so distracted by everything that was going on, including of course the election of Trump, that nothing else. Every new thing was immediate and sucked up all of our attention. So Benghazi was sort of finally declared by the left a horrific waste of time and egregious abuse of power by the right, and on the right it was confirmation of cover up of undetermined nature on the left's part. But we learned no lessons from it, just as we learned few lessons from the previous attacks that were somewhat similar, like the East Africa bombings and to some degree even 9/11 itself.
Yeah, for sure. I would like to rewind, as I mentioned, a little bit and tell me, how does one become a diplomat? So you mentioned earlier you're from California, so I was clarifying your accent as you said there. But
Well, I have no accent. The
but
Northern
it
California
does
accent.
sound a little bit international. But I'm not saying that's a bad thing. But it surprised
Praise
me.
the
But
Lord.
so you said you're from California, but what was your path? Is it something that as a teenager or younger saying, I want to grow up and be a diplomat, or is this something you landed into? How does one become in the or do this role?
That was always a big mystery for me, even in college. It sounded very exotic and fun, but the path to it seemed not so clear. I remember, the what I vaguely knew about it was you had to take a day-long test and or perhaps two, and there was a lot of role play and trick questions, which I thought, well, maybe I can pass on that.
Mm,
But so I mean, I took a very circuitous path to this, but I also had my uncle was an ambassador, and when I was a kid, I think I was more influenced by him and his wife as well, than I perhaps realized at the time. And I was always, Berkeley is a very international place, and it somehow was somewhat something between my father's an academic, my mother's an artist. It's sort of there was a lot of international stuff going on. Chris Stevens and I had a very similar sort of background, I think, and I think it allowed us to have some kind of connection without actually having spent ages working together in the same posts. We sort of knew where we each what each other's background was. But most immediately, I was working for an oil company in Houston at the time of 9/11, and I was thinking, actually, that was my path to. I wanted to work in Oman. I'd been to Oman previous years and had this idea that I'd love to go work there, and I thought that working in the sort of renewables innovation section of an oil company would get me there, but it wasn't. I was sort of sitting in Houston, and nothing wrong with Houston, but I wanted to get back to the region, and uh, then 9/11 hit, and I was thinking, the U.S. government has paid for me to have, I learned Arabic on a bunch of different fellowships, most of which were paid by the State Department, and it was time to give something back, and so. And they were advertising for Arabic speakers, so I think that and then I took a day-long test and another one, and wound up in the other end.
mm.
It's
So
actually a long. I mean, the clearance process is actually is very long, and you're never, even if you pass the test, you're not guaranteed a slot, so you have to sit and wait. And by the time I'd actually already taken another job when they called up, and I was like, oh yes, I really do want to do this.
mm,
Um, And then, surprise of all surprises, my first post is the most sort of unregulated, unbureaucratic assignment you could possibly get, and was essentially, it was almost I don't know, somewhat of a fluke. I mean, they sent me to Libya from the first tour, mainly because I think the vast majority of people who had any Arabic were sent off to Iraq, and they had just decided that new recruits, it was too dangerous to send them to Iraq, but we can send them to Libya. So, and Libya was actually at the time, considered to be reasonably safe. It changed over the years that I was there, but so that's how I ended up in Libya.
Yep. So, like I said, we're coming up on 10 years since the attack. So, remind me again how many years you were in Libya, and were you there around the time of the attack? And, kind of maybe paint a picture of what it looked like. You just mentioned that Libya, was safe for all intents and purposes. So, um, and how this became about, if you can there.
I'm sorry, how it became a.
How maybe the year or two leading up to the attack on Benghazi 10 years ago. So
Well, say as mentioned, I was in Libya for 2 years, from 2004 to 2006, based in Tripoli, but I spent a lot of time in myself wandering around Benghazi. It became pretty apparent quickly that Libya's political future was not determined solely by what happened in Tripoli, where Gaddafi had his seat, but that the far eastern city of Benghazi was kind of this sort of rogue question mark there were a lot of simmering discontent. Historically, any opposition to centralized power, and to Gaddafi in particular, it came out of the east. There had been a number of very sort of violent skirmishes between Gaddafi and the more Islamist radical factions in the east, that had resulted in particular in one very large and dramatic massacre in a prison in Tripoli in 1996. There was a lot going on. A lot of this was the purview of other agencies, which and I was not informed about those things. But I certainly talked to a lot of people, and there's a lot of you hear a lot of stuff on the ground talking to people. So again, it became clear to me that if we wanted to understand Libya, and we really didn't, Libya had basically been off the U.S. diplomatic and intelligence map for years, mainly. But if we wanted to know what was likely to happen in Libya and how we might affect it positively, we really should know what's going on in Benghazi. So I spent more and more time there. And again, when the Arab Spring broke out, first in Tunisia in late 2010, one question was, is this going to move to Libya? And most people, it skipped over to Egypt on the other side of Libya. So you had Tunisia unraveling on one side and Egypt on the other. And many people who were very experienced with the situation in Libya, Libyans and otherwise, basically just didn't believe that the Libyans would be able to break through that, and they did. And so that was what, at the time, I was working in the Gulf, and I, again, as I mentioned before, a colleague of mine and I decided that okay, the U.S. has just intervened. There's going to be a lot to do, and maybe we have the skills and the context to do something kind of a once in a lifetime, be of help. So we spent a year and a half putting together, reaching out to various. We decided that medical infrastructure was a priority. Certainly, when I was in Libya, one of the major complaints of most Libyans was the very poor medical infrastructure there. If you had something seriously wrong, you tended to go to Tunisia or Egypt. Last resort was staying in Libya. And if you went to a hospital, you'd see a line of taxis, all of whom which would take you to one of those two places, which was a long drive. So we built up this. So we went out and basically settled on a couple and went and tried to recruit U.S. teaching hospitals that had international kind of missions to come to Libya, and we got several sort of offers of interest, and one of them was a couple of teaching hospitals related to Harvard, and we made introductions while there were other such discussions going on. But the folks at Mass General came quickly, and they were focused on building both large training and mentorship for Libyan doctors. Anyway, that's a long backstory to all of that, but we were basically on the verge of trying to facilitate the signing of a multi-million-dollar contract between the Benghazi Medical Center, which was a 1,500-bed facility that was vastly underused, and those two teaching hospitals. And there was a lot of around just before September 11, 2012. There was a lot of tensions had increased. The threat situation in Benghazi had just changed dramatically over the months that we were going there, and as I mentioned in the book, I was very I did not want to go then. I thought that this was a mistake. But on the other hand, there was also this very short clear. It was sort of clear that things were deteriorating so fast that if we didn't get out there and try to finish some of the things that we've been working on, including this contract with Mass General, that it was going to be lost. And so there's sort of there was this tension within us, and whether do we take this risk, which was clearly a risk, or do we give up on this? And when you invest, there's a heavy weight of sunk costs, but there was also a feeling that this was sort of a now or never kind of moment. And well, my foreboding was unfortunately confirmed, and it was a hell of a few days. But and I was, enormously sad at the loss, not only to Chris, to Chris Stevens and the other three Americans, but for the promise of what could have been in Libya. And I think that we really had a large opportunity there that was missed because we didn't adequately predict where the levers were, what influence we actually had, and where we had very little influence.
Gotcha. And I struggle a little bit. I think the furthest east that I've been is Germany and Italy. I haven't actually been over, further to the Middle East over there. But I would say John Q. Public, the average American, if you ask them to point to Benghazi or Libya on a map, I doubt they would, most John Q. Public would be able to do that. So I was going to, I considered here drawing some parallels. So Benghazi, the city, is there any American city that kind of first to mind reminds you of Benghazi at all?
Huh, that's an interesting question. Well, in some ways, I mean, for reasons that are not all obvious. I mean, there's something about when I first got to Libya. There's something about many people, many older people in Libya. It was like they were locked in some sort of time. They were stuck in some sort of time trap. They were, there were a lot of hippies, sort of older professor types with long scraggly beards that had spent time in places like Davis and Seattle, and West Coast hippies. Mm-hmm. And some of them had marijuana farms, and some of them, I mean, they're all the kind of stuff that you wouldn't think. Artichokes were a big deal there. And some of it was actually a weird dispute over where the Libyan artichokes originally came from. They disappeared at one point, and someone would then accuse them of, someone in California then accused them of somebody in Libya of stealing a strain of anyway, all kinds of crazy things. But yeah, there's this sort of, the Libyans seem to have managed to come up with some sort of, these mechanisms for dealing with dictatorship that involved a lot of sort of humor and maybe, I don't know. It was a weird mix of people doing their own thing while having every other aspect of their life completely controlled. So wherever they found some area to be creative, they found it, and they found a way to do it in a way that wasn't threatening to the regime. So yeah, I'd say maybe a little bit of Berkeley, Davis, northeast. Though, I mean, of course, the Mediterranean. People don't realize one thing that seems to be shocking to people is that Benghazi is surrounded by a very lush area that looks like Napa Valley. So there's another. It's a very Mediterranean. Obviously it's a Mediterranean environment, and many of the sort of landmarks are similar to say the Bay Area.
Gotcha.
Of course, you get a little, you go a little bit south, and it gets very deserty very fast. So,
mm-hmm. And not too different from California either. So,
the valley.
So if we take, look at or consider like Berkeley, Benghazi. You had mentioned earlier, which I thought I don't necessarily going to draw some parallels to this whole abortion fight here in the U.S., but it was interesting that you said that if you were to go to the hospital and there was something seriously wrong with you, there was a line of taxis out front to take you next door. So, and that was quite a bit of a drive. So, just to give folks a picture here, from Benghazi to the next best hospital would be about how far of a drive or miles?
About maybe 4 or 5 hours.
Okay.
The Tunisian border was much closer to Tripoli. I mean, it depends on where you were. If you were in the west, in Tripoli, you would go to the Tunisian border. If you were in the east in Benghazi, you would probably go to Egypt, Alexandria, or something. But and actually, the Tunisians built a medical corridor, essentially catering only to along the border with Libya, catering only to Libyans. So you had this kind of like Las Vegas-esque strip malls on the Tunisian border where you could go. One block was optometry, the next was heart surgery, the next was something else. So, and interestingly, Tunisia became for a while a leading provider of medical tourism services. So Bulgaria, particularly for Eastern Europe, all based on that kind of historical accident with Libya.
Interesting. So the other point I'm getting at to Libya sounds like it's a little smaller than Texas.
I don't actually.
Approximately.
It's a large area, but it's not. But in terms of population, it's the size of Virginia. So you have 6.5, 7 million people, which is another misconception. People look at the Libya on the map, and it dominates North Africa, and it's right there, hanging below southern Europe, and it looks enormous. But when you end like, heck, how could we influence a country like this? But in fact, the population is collected. I sort of like refer to it as a string of colonies along the coast, where no one city is much bigger than I don't know what's Syracuse, New York. I don't off the top of my head know how many people are in Syracuse, New York, but it's not a big population. And the vast majority of Libyans are actually, at the time, before the intervention, were reasonably well disposed towards Americans. They hadn't been exposed to the angry rhetoric of the Arab media and towards the United States and the United States support for Israel and all those other things. They were sort of only people with access and connections really were exposed to the brunt of that. So there was a sort of a kind of Libya was sort of a bit of living in a previous time, which was an asset as far as Americans were concerned, because the memories were from the early post independence, when the United States was this benevolent, powerful presence that came, and or at least some people thought so, and helped them develop their oil industry and brought airlines and American classic cars, which is something that lots of Libyans are very, very, very fond of, and other things that are sort of uniquely American.
Gotcha. Okay. And the reason I'm doing that is it's trying to paint a picture for, again, John Q. Public, of the atmosphere, everything, possibly leading up to, the attack. The other thing, kind of a logistical thing, apparently our meeting is going to shut us down in 8 minutes. Is it showing you that timer?
No.
Okay. So worst case, what we'll do is we'll pause and I'll send you another link and we'll just start it back up again. And of course, I'll edit this out. So I don't know if I'll be able to upgrade it in time to get it there. So we'll get that in a minute. So, leading up to, the attack there, this was obviously 10 years ago. Gaddafi was still in power then, yes?
Gaddafi had been overthrown in late 2011.
Okay. So we're around that same time, and then maybe paint a little more of a picture, tell a story of what led up to the attack, and all the factions, and why America got involved, or just happened to get involved because of what was going on.
Well, the situation, there's been a lot of talk about whether the United States should have intervened in Libya. Essentially, the intervention in March of 2011 came from most immediately from a breakdown in communication between Gaddafi and the international community. He started to, and perceptions on his point that he was about to be overthrown by the United States. He made various sort of what were interpreted by the West as very dire threats against Benghazi, which was the center of the uprising. Sort of famous videos of Gaddafi screaming that he was going to pulverize the East and go street alley by alley hunting down whoever. And he wasn't specific about whoever, but a large portion of Benghazi felt it was them. So there was this huddle in the White House among Obama's senior advisors about what to do about this. Were we going to risk another Rwanda type situation, or were we going to stand up and protect the people of Benghazi? You had a number of figures who had been exposed to the aftermath of the Yugoslav split and humanitarian atrocities, as well as the Rwanda crisis and the Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia, etc., and felt like that particularly relative to the genocide in Rwanda, we weren't going to let this happen again. So there's a whole literature on all of that, and ultimately, obviously, the United States did intervene. But as President Obama later rued, the United States really hadn't planned for what came next. It was sort of a kind of a somewhat of a half measure. We would go in and make sure that Benghazi was essentially protected from a land assault, and then we weren't quite sure what was going to happen next. And of course, there were some people in the administration, like Defense Secretary Gates, who were saying, "Look, these kinds of things always lead to mission creep, and we're going to soon be, you break it, you own it, and this is going to be, we're overstretched in Iraq and Afghanistan as it is. This is not tenable." And that was the origin of the phrase sort of leading from behind, which I think one of the Obama administration people named this maneuver, but I don't think was a phrase that they particularly loved. And yeah, I mean, it's you can that was the genesis of the sort of the there was a bit of a hands-off posture on the US's part, that we weren't going to get involved in state building. We were there to help, and that we were there as part of an international coalition. And it was certainly the Europeans had the most obvious interest in shoring up the situation in Libya, because they were most affected by the flow of migrants and potential terrorist activity that would come out of Libya if it weren't domestic political squabbles, and didn't have and short-term political concerns, and didn't have they promised a lot, but they didn't deliver on that. So the US was sort of left holding the bag, and what we tried to do was involve other states we thought were on our side, who could basically be proxies in trying to protect our interests and the interests of the rebels writ large on the ground. So we had, countries like Qatar and Turkey were designated as sort of intermediaries, particularly on the front of supplying weapons and things. And some of those arms got diverted to radicals that ultimately were heavily involved in destabilizing Benghazi, and who almost certainly had strong connections to the attack.
Yeah. So, I mean, thanks for all this backstory, because it's been a while for me. It's been, that whole political hysteria about it that I remember, years ago. It's died down mostly, but what led you now to bring this out? You mentioned earlier it took you a couple of attempts to get the book published and so forth. So what led you to to write it? Obviously don't share all the secrets in the book, but anything you might be able to share.
Well, I think it disturbed me on a sort of visceral level, personal level, that as someone who was a partial witness to what went on, certainly the many of the events leading up to the attack, what was going on in the city, the I was in I was on the phone with the compound while the attack was going on. It wasn't clear whether we were also targets where we were, whether there was going to be an attack on the Tibesti Hotel where where I and my colleagues were staying. There, and then I remember, after the next day, I mean, it was I experienced this sort of prolonged sense of delayed or postponed panic from the time that we heard that there was an attack on the probable attack on the mission, and hearing the noise of the artillery RPGs and machine gun fire. And I mean, it was a very stressful, to say the least, night of trying to figure out, without much information, what the heck was going on and whether we were in imminent danger, what had happened to Chris Stevens. Chris had actually invited us over for dinner that night at the mission. And I had said, I had this thought in my mind, like, Chris, are you, you guys have security, but, what about us? And that thought, returned to me many times later. It's like, we could have been there, and sort of slight feelings of, I don't know, a combination of, I don't know, very mixed feelings of, yeah. Can you remind me what the question was?
So it's just the background, and it's very interesting.
Why is the book important? What am I thinking, trying to accomplish by writing this book now?
Right.
We finally got to there was this long period. The next morning, we were taken by our hosts who picked us up at the hotel and took us to the Benghazi Medical Center, where actually Ambassador Stevens had been taken after he was found outside inside or outside the mission. And we had this surreal experience of being inside the hospital, where we were going to meet and have a conversation with Chris Stevens and some of his people and our colleagues the next day to talk about this infrastructure project. Chris was insistent that he wanted to lend his and the United States sort of support to this initiative. So instead of that, we were sitting here in the midst of the aftermath of a gunfight at the hospital, which involved people coming in to take Chris Stevens' remains back to the airport. And some of the casualties were the casualties were sort of on both sides of this battle. So so our host did not want us to anyone to know that we were present, because we would be further in danger. And then we had this militia that looked, this crazy militia that I describe in the book, that took us to the airport. And as I was standing on the tarmac waiting for this, and then there was this whole question about whether we would be allowed to get to board the last commercial flight out. I was thinking that this was going to have consequences far beyond Benghazi. First of all, that it would have horrible consequences for U.S. support for Libya, and that Benghazi would see really tough days ahead. In particular, and that this could really change American foreign policy in the region in ways that I couldn't quite imagine, but just felt were on the way. And then I came back to the States, and by the time I had to wait in Turkey for a few days before one of my colleagues, my dear colleagues, who was Libyan American, decided to stay for a few days, and I had to wait for him. So I was in Istanbul waiting for him to join me, and I had been contacted I had written an op-ed for the New York Times, which was published the next day, basically just describing the atmospherics of what happened, and I meant it to be a tribute to Chris Stevens in large part. But I wasn't following the news. I went off and found some spot to swim every day and just sort of like try to work out what had just happened. By the time I got back to the States, the controversy over Benghazi was almost in full force. And my colleague and I were wondering how did we get from what we just experienced to this mudslinging over what happened, and how could we really be that? We thought we had a pretty good idea of what we saw on the ground at the time, and there were several other witnesses who had, all of us had a different piece of the puzzle, or a piece of different views of what had gone on there, and it did not seem like something that was going to be the subject of such great controversy. And just watching so I have very mixed feelings about how both sides of the aisle dealt with Benghazi, because I think there were two narratives that emerged over the days, weeks, and months, and I feel like the two narratives were truthful and false in different measure on both sides. And it was sort of like you had these two stories, neither of which, from our perspective, was really accurate, and no one to really challenge it. And I didn't, and then there's the question of do we get, and do those people who were witnesses, do they stand up and say, look, this is what we think happened? Do we? I certainly tried, but by the time one could actually, there was a time when you couldn't jump into the fray without being immediately pushed to one side or the other or ignored. And I wrote several op-eds, and I tried to be a bit I don't know, there's some things I wasn't quite sure of, and I felt like this was sort of really a 10-year quest to try to answer some of my own questions, to be absolutely certain about certain things before I said, well, this is what I think happened here. And I think it's really important. I felt it was really important to try to unravel the dynamics of the Benghazi scandal. I mean, really, if Benghazi had occurred in some other point in time, and not connected to other things like the election. I mean, obviously the fact that it was close to an election supercharged it, but also the fact that social media had sort of come into a maturing phase in terms of its polarizing power just around the time of Benghazi. I've interviewed a number of data scientists and social academics who study the evolution of social media, and there's a consensus that that the fall of 2012 around Benghazi was the time when social media really became, through its algorithms and prevalence and revenue models, etc., and usage, extraordinarily powerful tools to capture and put people into silos and make them hate each other like they hadn't before. So if you took this outside of those things, Benghazi had occurred in the middle of early in Obama's term, and before the next step in the evolution of social media and various other things, maybe things wouldn't have caught fire to the extent that they did. And then there's the fact that there was a pre-existing desire, sort of, it's almost like the Tom and Jerry scenario with the Republicans and Democrats, where the Democrats were sort of just waiting from the very early years of the Obama administration for some horrible terrorist-related attack to happen somewhere, and the Republicans to come and say, "Aha, we've got you," and deny them a second term. And I honestly think that was one of the factors that essentially made the Obama administration so careful that they and so worried about the results of calling things clearly that they became inadvertently a party to their own roasting in a way, if that's and so, you can blame all sides, but some of the things that the Republicans were saying were actually not so far from the truth, if not actually really accurate. Others were, you could call say crazy. But the same, the incomplete story and inaccuracy was not the provenance of one side or the other. It was like a dysfunctional dramatic married couple who want to kill each other. I mean, of course, things evolved. There's a lot more than that, but I think that dynamic has not been examined much. Also, the position, and again, I in this book I take pains not to take overt partisan sides. There's been so much of that. I mean, you've got 6 books on Benghazi that came out that were all sort of very, very right-wing, accusatory, and used Benghazi as a lever to get into all kinds of other things of which we're all very familiar. And on the Democratic side, you have lots of the slew of memoirs that came out later, which usually have a chapter devoted to Benghazi, in which is sort of like, well, it didn't really happen like that, and this is why. But there's never been really a time where someone to come in and say, look, this is where I think both sides contributed to this. And it's not like I think that if we all understand where Benghazi came from, that things are suddenly going to be great in America again. But I do think that its significance as an accelerator of the polarization in the United States, it has been underestimated, in part because nobody wants to talk about it, because it was such a mess with no anchor. I mean, the other thing, of course, is that Benghazi, as you were alluding to before, is completely unknown to the vast majority of Americans. So trying to imagine what was there's nothing familiar, very little familiar about the situation which could serve as a reference point. So it's the perfect scandal material. It's like you can paint whatever picture, both sides could paint whatever picture they wanted, and they did, and could expect that no one was going to call them on it. And even if they did, who cares? It's some person who claims to have some very obscure knowledge, So, and I think that's one. So that's sort of trying to not exactly set the record straight, but introduce some perspective on an event that I think really was a major political event in American history. I mean, like it or not, I mean, it was as unseemly as it was. You can't have a 4-year scandal like that impacts and impinges on an election and other everything. I sort of say that the world that we're existing in today is in many ways a world that has been at least partially shaped by Benghazi. I can elaborate on that, but that's a good place to end that thought.
Yeah. And so you had mentioned a couple of times as well that no lessons really have been learned. And I guess fully understandable that as a true government worker, you've got, what is it, the Hatch Act. You really can't be political. I assume you have since left the State Department, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So you can freely talk, but back in that role when all that was going down, I've worked with our federal government workers before as a vendor, and understood that the Hatch Act, that you cannot say political things, right? So but now that you can, and so and you said that no lessons really have been learned. Is it partially that the change in administrations along the way, and having only 4 to 8 years of a presidency to get in and implement or try to implement some of this stuff, and then all of a sudden there's a changing of the guard? Is that part of it, or is it just something else?
Well, sure, that's a very good point. I think if you, I try in the book to go back to the sort of the origins of the U.S. Middle East dynamic and how that has evolved and ultimately played a part in Benghazi. And what you see, if you look at the last 30, in particular the last 20 years of U.S. Foreign relations and relations with the Middle East, is a essentially repeated. How do I put this? I mean, short-termism is the sort of summary I would give. It's like we really don't look. Many things are determined by political pressures and immediate political goals, not long-term strategy. And each administration over the last 3 or 4 has managed in different ways to weaken and politicize the U.S. the foreign policy, security, and intelligence bureaucracies. So they're all at each other's throats and concerned that someone is going to come and blame them for something. And Benghazi just absolutely supercharged this whole thing, because everybody was pointing fingers at everybody else, and that was another element of the dynamic there. And I don't know. My personal view is that the Trump presidency was sort of a consequence of pre-existing dysfunctions, not the dysfunction itself. Trump was pretty clear about what he was about before he was elected, and either it shouldn't have been a surprise. But he was elected in part because people were frustrated with many of the things that came before, and most people didn't have the slightest idea of how dysfunctional some of the U.S. bureaucracies had become. The Iraq War, the Bush administration basically purged many of the put it this way. Lots of people left the State Department, were very unhappy, who had lots of knowledge and long-term Middle East hands were absolutely frustrated and very, very upset about the direction that U.S. policy was headed. And it didn't improve as time went on. And as the politicization became deeper and deeper, the desire to limit access of information and sharing of information across bureaucracies became smaller and smaller. So you had, and that led to poor decisions. I mean, the Obama administration basically had very little idea of what the Bush administration had done in Libya, which informed or didn't inform what it did in Libya. It really had no idea. I mean, it really is shocking that I mean, there were several people in I can't mention names, but senior officials who were basically had some visibility on U.S. Activity in Libya over a long stretch of time, particularly in the 90s and the time of the Algerian War. And you're talking about a handful of people trying to understand what's going on in a country without having anybody on the ground to confirm or investigate what was going on. So Libya was a big blank slate. And then from the time that I arrived in 2004 until the Libyan revolution, we really didn't take advantage of that time to try to get to know better what was going on in Libya either. And then you had this whole very crazy situation where the United States had a very well, I shouldn't say, had a very waffly relationship with organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood and the more radical Islamist groups. On one hand, before the in the 19 1990s, the UK in particular had collaborated with several of these organizations to try to to assassinate Gaddafi. The US, the degree to which the US was involved with that wasn't quite clear, but there was this idea that the radicals could help us get rid of somebody that we really didn't, who was really a nuisance, Gaddafi. And then at one point after 9/11, the relationship changed overnight to one of, we're going to capture them, render them back, torture. They were Exhibit A in the process of extraordinary rendition, whereby the CIA kidnapped terrorist suspects, took them to countries where they would be interrogated and presumably tortured, and so that was going on essentially in the background while I was posted to Libya. And then after that, we seem to have decided, along with the reconciliation with Gaddafi, that we really should try to reconcile with the radicals as well. So you had these people that had been allies and then enemies. We're now back to the sort of allies category, and we really didn't know what they thought or what their views of us were. But we tortured and killed many of them. So what do you expect they're thinking on some level, right? And no one was really keeping track. This is across, as you were mentioning before, across administrations. You have, the policies change. Some parts of policies change drastically, and other parts stay sort of the same. But nobody's really keeping track of consistency of the story. So when Libya is falling apart, ultimately we relied on many of these radicals to help us try to sew the country back together again, believing that the agreements that we had and they had through other partners like the UK were all still valid. So, in the end of the day, we got essentially surprised in Benghazi by people who we really should have been paying much closer attention to, let alone hiring to protect us. Each time an event like this happens, there hasn't been really a huddle back in Washington, or there's always a accountability review board and various investigations, but the prescriptions of those investigations are highly political, and you don't have any real substantive reform. And as Trump came in, essentially he decided to do away with much of this, clean house in the State Department and other agencies to I'm not even sure to a greater extent than was done before, but certainly more. So, Secretary of State Blinken, before he assumed current office as Secretary of State, said that essentially he blamed Trump for basically causing generations worth of damage to the State Department and other security and foreign affairs bureaucracies, when in fact this has been going on for a long time. I mean, Trump may have accelerated things, but you can't put it all on Trump. So the question is, what do we do about this? I mean, we really can't. There's a term, in certain parts of the Beltway, senior officials in the state, in the Defense Department, the State Department that I interviewed used this term, the Benghazi effect. That essentially meant it was meaning that the Benghazi basically took an existing sort of fear of political consequences of action abroad and just hit it out of the park, so that we were paralyzed, and we did not shore up the gaps that were existing from previous administrations, and we withdrew assets in countries like Yemen and other places where we needed to know what was going on the ground. As one former assistant secretary said, Benghazi was nothing short of an absolute disaster for U.S. foreign policy and diplomacy, because it basically left us blind, and further encouraged the use of instruments like drone warfare, which has certainly not helped things in places like Yemen, and that's a gross understatement. And basically blinded us to things that 2012, what was going on? Assad was hanging at the time of Benghazi. Assad, Syria's president, was hanging by a thread. Or at least that's what we thought. And yet, three months after Benghazi, he's bounced back. Now I go into there's a lot of complicated. There are links between what was going on in Libya and what was going on in Syria, and those have never been properly untangled. I mean, various publications tried to get at it, but they were accused of being pro-Republican or otherwise dissuaded from going and were incapable of pursuing those links. But certainly Benghazi, as one prominent journalist expressed it with respect to Syria, that Benghazi probably killed the whispers of a strong Syria policy. It's not like we would have gone in and done something dramatic or productive otherwise, but all of the attempts to try to find a better solution were essentially shelved. And there's also the question of Benghazi's impact on the election in 2016, which I think because of the other scandals like the obvious uproar over Clinton's emails and the Russian post-fact, the Russian cyber attacks, etc. People don't realize that pretty much all of the factors that have been blamed in some way or at some point and in some way for tipping the election to Trump have Benghazi as a common denominator. The Russians used Benghazi memes and characters as feedstock for their bot campaigns and things. There are a number of collections of those that have been analyzed and commented upon. The email issue with Clinton was brought to light directly because of the Benghazi committee. The Republicans probably would not have found and aired that with such timeliness and vigor had Benghazi not been established as a platform to do that. The Comey announcements also tie into that. It's part of had Benghazi not occurred when it did and been done what it did, it's really hard to see that. Well, of course, you can't replay history, so you can't say for sure that, what would have happened. But it's very of all the factors, I think Benghazi has not received its due in terms of its influence on the election and everything that came after it, as well as the phenomenon of fake news and polarization. I mean, it was just a perfect crucible for all of the elements that were designed to enrage both sides. And I think that's worth looking at least if we're going to pause at if we're going to think back about, things happen at such a fast pace that people rarely have time to sit and think about, how do we get here? And I think it's well worth. We couldn't look at Benghazi because it was so politicized for so long, but it's well worth trying to figure out what really were as best we can, what were the dynamics that led to Benghazi and what were the impacts and how has it hurt the United States? Because I think that Benghazi really has damaged a great number of interests of the United States, and you could argue that maybe these things would have expressed themselves in other ways, but at the very least, it was an accelerator of the sort of political and social political ills that we're seeing today.
So to the conservative person possibly listening to this, any sort of blame that went back to that time, from your point of view, and you don't have to answer this. I was just curious if you would, to the conservative person listening to this, is there anything that should have been done better? Is there any blame that should have been placed anywhere? I'm curious if you're able to say anything like that.
I mean, look, I'm avowedly liberal, so I'm not going to my sympathy, my views are sort of center left, but and I think that the whole Benghazi issue and many of the things that came out of it were incredibly should not have happened, should not have been expressed. But I'm more concerned about the things that I feel like I can do something and potentially views that I can potentially influence. And I think that the Democrats really need to look at the way that they respond to external attacks and find a better way of expressing their mission, their vision, and their convictions. I think that to some degree Benghazi was a result, and the violence of the attack was as a result of a failure to just describe things as they were, and not be controlled by. I mean, it's difficult because I really can you can put yourself in the position of anybody in the Obama administration looking at the things that were going on and thinking, heck, we're going to be attacked from in every which way for this. What's better? What's least risk? What's the strategy that we can implement that would be most positive? But again, it's short. I argue in the book that it was really driven by short-term concerns, like does Obama get a second term? Not what's going to happen down the line. Nobody really thought that Benghazi was going to be an issue after the election. But there were casualties. I mean, first you had, Susan Rice got caught up in the whole talking points issue. If your listeners remember that, and then of course, as soon as the election was over, the heat-seeking missile goes straight for Hillary Clinton. And there's another subtlety there. I mean, Hillary Clinton has been viewed through the eyes of her. Not, I don't think. How do I put this? There are many characters in the Benghazi saga, and it's worth trying to put oneself in the position of each one of them and try to figure out, if you were that person, given the politics, your immediate politics, that is within your own party, and the politics of the opposition now and in the future, contingent on your own political ambitions. What the heck do you do? I mean, for Clinton, what could she actually have done if she felt that? I mean, Clinton had disagreed with Obama's policy on Middle East issues many times before she became his Secretary of State, and that was part of the reason that he brought her on. But she had basically the White House determined narrative, and Clinton presumably had to stick to that narrative to some degree or other, regardless of what she felt. So it's an interesting question that hasn't really been asked: is what would you do? I mean, I got called before the Benghazi committee, and I have to say that after that experience, I had much more sympathy for Clinton than I did before, because it's just what do you say? You're sort of at the mercy of whatever questions are asked. And everything is political. There's no taking a stand and saying, this is what I think for country and God and country. So yeah, I mean, I think basically the sum of it is that 10 years is kind of an amount of time where one hopes that you could sort of look back at this incident or that period of time and say, okay, this is what we thought at the time, but what have we learned since? And how might that help us, regardless whether it's as a country, shoring up democracy, as a party and a political strategist? What do we take from this? And I go into great detail about how Benghazi basically turned many of the U.S. into a risk-averse country. And you can't be a global leader and be risk-averse. I think that's something that some leaders on both parties certainly agree with. We have abdicated. We are essentially absent in the Middle East right now. And many people would say, "Oh, great, that's terrific. We should have been absent from the Middle East a long time ago." But the fact is, as has been shown with the invasion of Ukraine and other major incidences, you if you're not present, you have no way of influencing the outcome, or limited means. So you can't just pull up roots and expect that things will be better, because something is going to pull you back in, and you better it's and that's why foreign policy professionals are paid to think about, not much, but paid to think about these things.
Yeah, for sure. So to ask, equal time to the other side, obviously you just said you're a little more liberal. I'm somewhere in there too. So I have not heard the talking point. However, now that all of this stuff is going on with Trump and his administration and his company, and of course the conservative side is saying it's a witch hunt. You've got, the financial guy pleading guilty and everything. A lot of memes and a lot of sentiment is remembered, but her emails. And so, as we've talked about in this episode, going back to Clinton's, email server and all that, from a liberal point of view, all of the stuff that we went through the Trump administration in those 4 years, and it all, is banging to almost a Benghazi attack in DC on the Capitol. Now, obviously, there were not fire bombs and all that kind of stuff going on, but to no one's, I mean, it was, uh, an attack, that happened in Benghazi, an attack that happened in DC. So where, how does a very liberal person, maybe even more liberal than the two of us, when they see the sentiment from our fellow Americans of, well, by God, I'm not going to, claim that anything that Trump did, he walks on water, he's a god, because I hated the Clintons, I hated Barack Obama. Are there any words of wisdom, because you've lived through this, you've been the federal staffer, you were in the bureaucracy, you've now left the bureaucracy. Do you have any words of wisdom for those of us that are frustrated about folks that just cannot see this much further than what's in front of their face? Does that make sense?
Well, I'm not sure the bureaucracy is going to add that much clarity to this. I think that there are certainly, the bureaucracies are not, and the U.S. government is not flexible enough as much as it should be, and that's part of the problem. I think if our institutions were work at a more micro level, not like democracy, but if our institutions were working better and more and communicated with one another, and none of this would have happened, because they would have done their job, because we would have trust in, okay, Benghazi happens, and there's we have our intelligence services and the State Department giving us the read quite quickly on what went on, and no one's going to argue with them. But because of the politicization that I talked about before, and the fact that successive administrations have used the bureaucracies to on both sides to advance their points, either in defense or as an attack. And I think that there is blame to be had for using bureaucracies politically either way. That is one part of the problem, and it's linked up into the whole nature of the system as it is now. How do you? And it's a extraordinarily complicated problem. Essentially, the system and the technology that we have developed to help us in various other aspects of our life are all conspiring to, and not literally, but to feed the voice of extremes, and that has to be disabled somehow. And
Allegedly Google has a sentient AI, but I'll digress. But
this is even scarier. But that's like under the hood stuff. You need to understand what's going on, and who's the career foreign service officers, the career intelligence agents, the people at the Congressional Research, all of NSA. These people do not recognize the work environment in which they started. I mean, the older people. It's far more malleable, and that can be, to some, it depends on everything depends on context, yeah. But again, Benghazi was a perfect opportunity. If there were some sort of adults in the room, to use that metaphor, to look at, okay, something happened here, and it was the result of not a random. We came to some tenuous consensus that this wasn't a random act, that it was a terrorist attack, and it came from somewhere. Where did it come from? I'm fairly convinced that there was a connection. I mean, if you read through the details of the various reports, and both before and after the attack, it is very clear that there was an Al-Qaeda connection. And it really depends on whether you call it Al-Qaeda or something else, is a function of whether you believe that such and such group is actually technically Al-Qaeda or not. And Al-Qaeda at the time was trying to infiltrate Libya, and their strategy was to use proxies. So you can argue to death what who is actually responsible, but if that's it's not a semantic issue, and it requires a systematic evaluation of how do we get there. And if you go, and that story, as I alluded to before, goes back at least 2 administrations. Like, what the heck were we doing, kidnapping and torturing Libyan Afghans and sending them back to more of the same by Gaddafi? And what did we expect was going to happen once they were integrated into society at that point, if Gaddafi were to disappear? And you can sort of simply, any one of these parties, you can also put yourself in a position of somebody who, regardless of whether you agree with the ideology, which of course vast majority of us would not, being kidnapped and tortured probably doesn't incline you to be generous with your views of the United States and its presence in a country that has just overthrown its leader.
Yeah.
And we keep doing this. I mean, it's not a stretch for people to imagine. We keep doing these things over and over again. I mean, supporting the Afghan Mujahideen back in the early late 70s, early 80s was, the original sin as far as many of these ideologies go.
Yeah.
Have we learned much since then, or have we basically sort of made the problem just more complicated? Do we think that Al-Qaeda is a phenomenon that's over, or are there lessons to be learned in terms of how we, each of our reactions to these major events, starting with the original 9/11, has empowered radicals, not lessened their influence. And I think their biggest negative influence has been on the way that Americans talk to one another. That has been a lever for the fissures between the right and the left, along with, and it's attached to other identity markers like whether it's race or the usual things, religion, immigration, etc. Benghazi was sort of like this kind of like open canvas where each side could accuse the other of their deepest, darkest sins, and not be shown to be wrong, because there's, essentially it's just reflecting what we're thinking, not what's actually happening on the ground in Benghazi.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk about your book's coming out September 6th, right?
One hopes, yes.
It's a couple of weeks away. But again, plug your book. Sorry, go ahead.
There are major paper shortages. COVID has introduced all kinds of wrenches into the publishing works. So, I mean, I never thought that a publisher might actually conceivably run out of enough paper to print books, but that hasn't happened. So yeah. Yes, out on the 6th.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you've heard this. I think I've mentioned on previous episodes, I'm Sesame Street generation, and my reading comprehension is awful. The last book that I read cover to cover, Siri on an iPad read it back to me. So, so I don't think you should worry about the paper shortages. I think people are, it's here 2022. We have other devices to see it on. But what the name of the book, if you will, again, because you're here to talk about your book.
It's easy. It's Benghazi, ! A new history of the fiasco that pushed America and its world to the brink. the origin of that title is a story alone, but I'll spare you. I think the easiest thing is Benghazi is a pretty recognizable word. But I have to say that one of the other things that I really wanted to do in this book is sort of humanize the city and the people of Benghazi and Libya. And I got to know many people very well. It's not I was really quite upset about at the time about the Bay's film on Benghazi, 13 Hours. I mean, the book upon which it was based is a very almost technical commando eye view of the attack as they lived it, and I thought that there's nothing objectionable there. But the movie really and various other things, other media presented Benghazi as a cardboard, what would you say,
like shooting range, or
a stand-in. It has nothing, very little to do with the reality on the ground. I find Benghazi, Benghazi's been destroyed a couple times in its modern history, and it's been destroyed once again by the aftermath of Benghazi and the fighting that occurred after that. But it's a culturally very rich and beautiful city in many ways, and that's how I went back to Benghazi. I talk about this in the book as well. I went back to Benghazi at the end of 2016. And I felt partly that I needed to sort of exercise some of the visions of the attack itself, and try to reclaim some of the feelings that I had for the place before it. And I think that succeeded to some degree. But it's yeah. So the book is a sort of one of my editors called it a love letter to the city of Benghazi. So that's, along with all of the political stuff, there's a lot of my impressions of the city and my interactions with people at different times, and how their perceptions of the United States have changed over time, and what they hope for in the future, which is certainly very much in doubt right now.
yeah. Well, and that's why I hope you might agree that I try to draw some parallels to John Q. Public, the American, of painting this picture. I mean, you live there. I've never been to Libya. I would say probably less than maybe 2 or 3% of Americans ever been to Libya. You may have a better statistic than that on me, but just trying to at the end of the day, you've got all these talking points. You've got social media. You've got both liberal and conservative media, going at these talking points back and forth. This is probably the best in the middle discussion that John Q. Public, if they sat down for an hour and a half and listened to it about the story, especially timely that it's going to be 10 years since all that went down. But it's not just that one event. As we've talked about in this episode, it was everything leading up to it. There's so many different political forces and local forces and everything that it happened. So I think it's been a good episode. Hope you agree.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to talk with you, and yeah, I thank you for having me.